Hello, everybody, and welcome to the American Literature Association's International T.S. Eliot panels. I'm Nancy Gish, and I want to begin by encouraging everyone to join the T.S. Eliot Society and to attend our virtual meeting this September. You can do that by just clicking on the link that's in chat now. Eliot research is extremely exciting right now because there's so much new material and it's becoming available and it never was. So the Eliot Society is really the best place to present that research and also meet other scholars and discover that we're all a lot of fun. We have a full double session today. So I just have to make a couple announcements about technical stuff. This session is being recorded for a live audience and it's going to be used at the ALA conference in July. If you don't wish to be recorded, you can log off now and view the panels by joining ALA, which means it won't be free, but you can do it. You can also make sure your video is turned off if you don't want to be part of that recording. This panel is being moderated by Eliot Society members Tony Kuda, Patrick Query, and Francis Dickey, who, unlike me, know how to do technology. Please direct any technical questions to one of them in the chat, which will be disabled for general use, but remain active for messages to the hosts. For 15 minutes after each section, the Q&A session, the question and answer session, will be moderated by Patrick Query. If you have a question, please send him a message directly in chat that simply states whom the question is for and what it's about. For example, you could say, question Nancy about the role of Dido in the wasteland, probably a bad idea because I would probably talk too loud. Or question for William about lines 40 to 43. Send these anytime during or after the speakers finish. Patrick will select among many questions and call you once the panel has ended. So now I'm just delighted to introduce the first panel, and both of these sessions have just marvelous speakers. Our first panel is on translations and relations in the 21st century wasteland. And the first speaker is William Best of the University of Calgary, our international person today. It's called The Digital Wasteland 2020.
Okay, so yeah, I will have to say out loud slide from time to time to cue Tony to switch the slides, but we'll start from the top just to make it a little bit easier here. Years ago, while reading Marion Moore's Octopus for what was perhaps the first time on the web, it occurred to me that I wasn't reading it the same way that I read it in my codex copy of Observations. The majority of my time with the poem was in fact spent on pages that are not strictly speaking the poem at all. Slide. The poem proliferated into various other windows. In digital form, poetry like Moore's and Eliot seems not only to permit, but to encourage a particular type of reading. There's a desire to know or desire to connect built into signifiers, particularly those for which we do not have ready connections. And because of the speed and ease of accessing vast pluralities of text online, this desire produces a different reading method than in codex. In an Eliot Society panel, I think it's safe to assume that we're all here aware of the abundance of criticism on intertextuality within the wasteland and familiar with Eliot's proto-intertextual theory as Adolphe Haber describes it. What I will note as sort of a given here for sake of time is that I take one of the primary arguments in the wasteland to be a fundamentally intertextual conception of language, and that the poem's methods in delivering this argument have historically hampered the poem's accessibility outside of arguably elite readerships. The quote-unquote problem with the highly intertextual plan of the wasteland, in Lawrence Rainey's words, is twofold. First, it lacks an explicit grounding, which is to say its grounding principle is represented not as a cogent narrative or lyrical subjectivity or an explicit symbol, despite what Eliot says of Tiresias in the notes, but as an absence, as an interstitial space between the various images Eliot depicts on the page, as well as off the page via his notes and allusions. As Rainey argues, the poem does not lack cohesion, but is rather exceedingly connected, such that whether or how the Sibyl, Sesostris, Marie, etc. are related remains indeterminate due to its pluripotentiality, based on the connections drawn between them for a given readership. And the same, of course, is true intertextually for a given image, such as famously in A Handful of Dust. But that overconnectivity is precisely the point of the poem's technics. The center or meaning arrives in the interstitial space of conversation between all the various figures that function indeed akin to an objective correlative. Though the poem dramatizes this intratextually, the intratextuality is largely illegible in the piece without intertextual connections beyond the edges of the page, as is implied by the poem's citational notes, which can only be discerned in an abstract or cognitive sense in the moment of reading it in codex form. And this raises the second problem. Eliot's allusions are often rather esoteric, such that only a very limited readership would be familiar with more than a handful of his short fragments. Slide. And his notes are most often vague near the point of indeterminacy. The result of this, for those following Huyson's famous Great Divide, is a sense of elitism in the poetry, requiring a readership with an arguably elitist liberal arts education, with due respect to the robust scholarship of David Chenet's complicating this view. The web, I argue, addresses both of these problems. To take the second point first, the sense of elitism is to a large extent the result of a hyper-limited audience who would be able to read and understand the language. On this point, Gail MacDonald notes, it's important to distinguish between difficulty and accessibility. Slide. The poem is, MacDonald posits, difficult no matter what one does with it. Part of its argument is that the function of language is always involved with struggle. Accessibility, on the other hand, is a matter of legibility. Slide. If one does not know what or where London Bridge is, slide, or was, Eliot's Bridge went south for the winter, or cannot read 6 different European languages, then attempting to read certain parts of the poem is akin to attempting to read Gaelic when one only knows Mandarin. It is indeed not difficult at all. The difficulty is missed entirely because the reader has no intertext to provide any meaning for the squiggles on the page. The web, however, alleviates this inaccessibility and thereby enhances the difficulty by providing any given reader with intertexts. This is not to say that web reading undermines all elitist arguments against the poem. One can still clearly see the poem as establishing a canon built almost entirely out of privileged white Europeans, and Latin in particular will always have long established historical connotations of elitism. Slide. But the poem is no longer restricted in its audience to a particular, arguably elite readership. The rapidity of the web permits some understanding for all of these sources immediately, in the moment of reading Eliot's poem, and permits that the reader herself discovers the intertextuality rather than being handed it by, say, an annotated edition. Slide. That is, in Bertrand Gervais's terms, interpreting the meaning is a process of discovery rather than one of revelation, which Gervais notes is important for a sense of developing one's own interpretation rather than being provided with one and thereby loosening the important elements of difficulty and plasticity. Returning to the first point, this kind of web reading makes manifest what was previously only cognitive or abstract in earlier intertextual theory. Slide. The various windows open above or below or alongside Eliot's poem dilute the sense that what one is reading is Eliot's The Wasteland, making that one poem merely one page in a series of other pages that are all layered together like pages in a book. And thus it becomes visually and procedurally apparent to the reader that what one is reading is not merely one thing, but a Bartesian mosaic or a Deleuzian constellation of texts of indefinite number and indefinite authorship, all speaking together intertextually to develop a unified aesthetic or meaning. To read Eliot's The Wasteland is also to read, perhaps, a mythology page on the Sibyl of Cumae, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, maps of Munich and the Starnbergersee, Google translations of Petronius and Wagner, etc., all of which intertextually influencing the reading of one another, such that Weston develops an unavoidably Eliotic timbre, just as the Sibyl of Cumae takes on the semblance of James Fraser's Hanged God. Slide. In Ampula Pendera. And along with the assembled text, it is important to note that this takes place in real time. It is an active collection and correlation of intertext by the reader in the present moment, rather than merely a connection of the present text with text the reader has previously read or in anticipation of future reading. Hence, the intertextuality in such a reading operates with an additional mechanism, what I call active intertextuality, wherein the intertexts are not purely abstractions recalled by the reader's brain, but actively collected on the screen in the moment of reading itself. Slide. As Catherine Hales describes, this represents, quote, texts as clustered in assemblages, wherein the dynamics or meaning elicited through a reading comes from the interaction of all the texts collectively. And putting George Landau into conversation with Hales, slide, he would add that the reader herself performs the assemblage, drawing her own constellation, which is to say, her own text, from within the Bartesian, quote, galaxy of signifiers. One does not indeed necessarily read Eliot's The Wasteland. This is going to get a little heavy. This is not indeed necessarily to read Eliot's The Wasteland, slide. One perhaps reads one line of or stanza of The Wasteland, slide. Then a Google Maps view of the Munich Hofgarten, slide. Then zooms to the Starnberger See, slide. Then the city of Munich's tourism page on the Starnberger See, slide. Then a Britannica page on King Ludwig II, who either drowned or was murdered there and occasionally resided at the Munich residence in which the Hofgarten sits, slide, when he wasn't staying at his newly built Neuschwanstein castle. The reader then notes his patronage of Richard Wagner, slide. One learns that Ludwig built him the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, and on the Bayreuth Festspiele page, slide, one learns Tristan und Isolde was exclusively performed there from 1883 to 1903, and it was largely constructed to premiere the Ring cycle, slide. Then one finds the libretto to read Ode und Leer das Meer in the former, and read of Albrecht's, quote, Rape of the Rheingold from the Rhine Maidens in the latter, slide. Wa la 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 la. This process does not merely refer to a semiotic field within the reader's neural language centers. It refers to that which the reader has never read or no longer remembers. This active reading draws intertextually on a prosthetic brain, encoded with information and interpretation of that information by the demos en masse. It is, in a sense, a massive codification of a whole society's semiotic field of reference. One no longer needs to have a classics background to recognize and understand the relevance of the Cana Trimalchionis immediately. Any reader can do so within seconds of reading the words on Eliot's page, and indeed, researching mid-reading reinforces the sense of deferral and intertextuality encoded within the structure of Eliot's poem. Moreover, when performing an active intertextual web reading like this, it becomes further apparent that the citational deferral of The Wasteland is not merely from the poem to Petronius and back, slide, nor a linear signifying change, slide, but an endlessly self-proliferating web, slide. In order to understand The Wasteland, the poem demands, sorry, one more slide there. There we go. In order to understand The Wasteland, the poem demands departure to 50 other texts. But on the web, in order to understand each of those 50, likewise, one must depart to 10 more pages each, and on and on. This has always been inherent to structural and post-structural semiotics. The difference here is that the reader actively performs the web deferral function rather than the function taking place abstractly within a reader's mind. And the limitations on understanding any given term are not based on the reader's preformed frame of reference or social controls on that frame, but on a far larger socially constructed field. A web, The Wasteland, indeed both dramatizes the poem's own intertextual functions more effectively than a codex form can, and in the process democratizes the poem's accessibility beyond a hyperlimited audience familiar with Eliot's esoteric language. In closing, I would note one particular concern for active intertextuality, that is, mechanisms of control. In the Codex era, information access and therefore intertextuality was indeed controlled in an elite fashion by authors and publishers and experts who determined what was read and by whom. In short, by archons. As Landau, McGann, and many others have noted, the web is a highly democratizing space. Methods of dissemination and access are indeed taken out of the hands of an elite and seemingly passed on to the public at large. Seemingly, but not wholly. Marie and her Archduke uncle and the Hofgartners do fall to stony rubbish, slide. Fisher kings hold up in mythic castles while their lands go to waste. but the Blakean crowds flowing over London Bridge are no more free in their movement despite the absence of these cultural elites. Slide. Oh, that's the right slide. The flow of the crowd itself dictates the lifeless, agencyless movement of its individual subjects. And the crowd is directed by these chartered streets unerringly toward the financial district by the clarion call of St. Mary Woolnoth's, which chimes the start of the business day. The traditional archons may be absent, but one's navigation of the web and what sources are accessible are still controlled, importantly, by largely obfuscated forces, that is, by search algorithms. And search algorithms are both controlled by a new sort of archon, as well as by social patterns, such as Bing's click-through rate or Google's PageRank system. Slide. These corporations and coders can and often do manipulate the search results, and democratically determined algorithms necessarily dictate one's reading practices. As Deleuze describes it, the present epoch may have lost much of the society of discipline described by Foucault, but has been replaced with a society of control. Slide. Even if one theoretically has freedom of movement and access via the vast number of intertexts on the web, that choice of sources, Deleuze notes, is a form of control. The algorithms can and do effect a universal modulation, which Deleuze further writes amounts to a new system of domination. Slide. In Nick Carr's famous essay, Is Google Making Us Stupid?, he compares himself and other web readers to Hal from Stanley Kubrick's 2001, where Dave enters Hal's brain and begins modifying the circuitry. Over the past few years, Carr writes, I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain. Carr's sense is, of course, correct, and this has always been the case to a certain extent. However, with the shift from authoritative structures to algorithmic controls, it's easy to miss that just because a scientist is not visibly fiddling with the circuits, something is still playing with the wires. Because of its overt encouragement for active intertextuality, the digital wasteland both undermines the elitist limitations and simultaneously draws attention to how the textual modus of the web is still invisibly tinkering with our brains. Slide. Thank you.
The second speaker, or now the first, is Susan Edmunds from Syracuse University, speaking on Eliot at the Border, Reimagining the Wasteland as a Translation Space.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to begin with an apology. I am presenting this talk from my apartment, and road work just started outside, so I've now moved into the hall of my building, and the mailman is distributing the mail. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. The mailman will go soon. So I wanted to thank everyone for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm delighted to be here. The excitement is good for me. So I look forward to the rest of the panel as well. Originally, I was invited to give this talk when we thought that we were going to San Diego, and so that might make a little bit more sense of the things I'm going to say. In this paper, I examine the place of the wasteland in Valeria Luiselli's Lost Children archive. Luiselli makes the textual body of Eliot's poem a place that her migrant child characters enter and in which they threaten to disappear, when she superimposes Eliot's Heart of Light onto the US-Mexico border in the culminating sections of her novel. At the same time, she positions the wasteland as the movable or translatable place of origin for the themes, forms, and methods on which Lost Children archive as a whole depends. And in doing so, translates Eliot's original poem into a new time and place. To develop this reading, I draw on Luiselli's own work as a scholar, translator, and public intellectual, paying special attention to her 2015 Columbia University dissertation. Columbia makes all of their dissertations accessible online if anyone becomes interested in this dissertation. In the dissertation, the dissertation's name is Translation Spaces, Mexico City in the International Modernist Circuit. In the dissertation, Luiselli examines a series of circulating textual and fixed architectural spaces in Mexico City that functioned as, quote, translation spaces through which early 20th century Mexican artists and intellectuals engaged the wider phenomenon of international modernism. Playing on a productive tension between the Latin roots of the English translation and the Spanish word traducción, she defines translation space as a dimension in which, quote, translation in literal terms takes place, as well as, quote, a locus of practices that imply translatio and traductio, a transfer, a transportation, a carrying over, but also conducing or leading someone through a space, end quote. In addition, translation spaces serve as, quote, spaces for modes of carrying over different parts of the past into the present, end quote. These definitions informed Luiselli's discussion of the wasteland in her dissertation, and we might read that poem as a translation space in all of the senses that she gives us. Luiselli argues that the poem had a broadly generative effect on Mexican and Latin American literary culture when it appeared in Enrique Munguia's Spanish translation in the July 1930 issue of the Mexico City-based journal Contemporáneos. As the first journal to introduce literature originally written in English to a Mexican readership, Contemporáneos was itself a vital translation space that helped to set the terms of Latin America's engagement with international modernism. In turn, Luiselli argues that Munguia's translation of Eliot's, quote, paradigmatic modernist poem, end quote, also transformed it, in keeping with Lawrence Venuti's discussion of modernist translation as, quote, a creative locus of innovation. Munguia's decision to translate Eliot's poetry into prose and replace British working class slang with snippets of Mexican street talk stamped the poem with the impeccably modern rhythms of the Spanish prose poem and blurred the linguistic boundaries of London and Mexico City. At the same time, his Spanish translation of the title El Páramo, in referencing the distinctive neotropical highlands of Central and South America, carried the wasteland over to Latin American ground, where Juan Rulfo would rework its tropes to new ends in his 1955 novel, Pedro Páramo. Munguia introduced his translation of The Wasteland with a prologue, which sought to articulate the significance of its achievement for a Latin American audience. Writing from Geneva, he cast Eliot as a fellow continental American in exile, who had found in fragmentation, discontinuity, and intermittence a formal equivalent to the, quote, emotional exhaustion, desolation, and terror, end quote, that characterized the inner life of, quote, the cultivated modern man. Most important for Luiselli's purposes was Munguia's discussion of Eliot's multilingual, quote, use of sources. In a firm rejection of the aesthetic agenda of Mexico's revolutionary nationalists, Munguia cast Eliot not as a slavish colonial imitator of essentially foreign imperial metropolitan legacies, but rather as a true cosmopolitan whose, quote, intimate acquaintance with tradition is something at the same time subordinated to him and an integral part of his thinking, a function and mode of being, end quote. Munguia's account of Eliot's personal incorporation of world tradition as a function and mode of being directly informs remarks Luiselli made earlier this spring about her compositional method in Lost Children Archive. In response to a Syracuse University student's question about the novel's use of, quote, outside sources, she explained, quote, I don't think so much in terms of outside sources as how the novel can enter into conversation with the material that it is made from. The Latin root for fiction, fingere, to knead or to mold something out of clay, implies that fiction is not something that just comes out of nowhere, but that it is a reshaping of what there is. And then in that reshaping, you're also leaving behind your fingerprints. The process of creation is also somehow being recorded, and what is outside sources is not really out. It's all kind of internal to fiction. It's how you take what you have, what you observe, what you collect, and give it one particular shape, end quote. In Lost Children Archive, Luiselli, like Munguia and Wolfo before her, claims the text of The Wasteland as a foundational part of the clay, the soil, of her own novel, even as she claims Eliot's innovative poetic method as the model for a way of conversing with the material from which art is made. She then mixes that clay with the sediment of her experiences working as a volunteer interpreter for a New York City immigration court charged with the task of processing the asylum claims of undocumented child migrants from Central America. That's work she undertook as soon as she finished her dissertation. Folding the translation spaces of Eliot's original poem and of its Latin American translators onto the space of the US-Mexico border, she transposes the, quote, paradigmatic site of modern crisis from Britain's imperial metropole to the latest battlefront in a, quote, hemispheric war, end quote, whose child refugees retrace routes of dispossession and disappearance laid down by their indigenous forebears. The novel's plot follows the progress of true groups as they unwittingly journey toward one another. The first group, a family of 4, travels by car from New York City south and west along the border, while the second group, made up of migrant children from Central America, travels north towards, quote, the unreal desert where, quote, under the brown fog of a desert dawn, a crowd flows over the iron wall, so many, none thought the trains would bring so many. In an image that merges the crowd on London Bridge with, quote, those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, end quote, Luiselli stitches together Eliot's reference to the barbarian threat posed to European metropoles by the Bolshevik Revolution and the dominant US political and media narrative about the current border crisis. As her novel's mother character notes, this narrative portrays, quote, please don't do that. No. That is my property and I'm giving a talk. You cannot go in there.
This is your property?
Yes, I said no. I apologize. As her novel's mother character notes, this narrative portrays, quote, the nations that are systematically abused by more powerful nations as a no man's land, a barbaric periphery whose chaos and brownness threaten civilized white peace, end quote. In contrast, Luiselli follows Rolfo in reframing Eliot's wasteland as a land of ghosts created by the ongoing violence of the New World's overlapping colonial histories. In Rolfo's novel, the Mexican Revolution fails to break the hold of the Spanish colonial cacique system, which has produced the monstrous fisher king Pedro Páramo, who willfully starves the townspeople of Comala to death. Taking up the threads of the same colonial histories 2 generations later, Luiselli casts her child characters as casualties of a decades-long, quote, drug war that stretches from, quote, the Great Lakes of the northern United States to, quote, the mountains of Salac in southern Honduras, end quote. Her novel dramatizes the inequities undergirding this war by contrasting the 2-story arcs of Translatio and Traductio that eventually converge in Arizona's Sonoran Desert. Guided by a coyote, the migrant children board the infamous La Bestia, which carries them on a terrifying journey across Mexico. After the coyote is shot along with some of their comrades trying to cross the border, they enter the Sonoran Desert leaderless and alone. In contrast, the 2 children from New York journey south in a family car navigated by their parents, who are working on separate documentary sound projects, one about the last days of the Apache's stand against the US government, and the other about the current border crisis. Guided by their parents' knowledge and passionate storytelling, the 9-year-old boy and his 5-year-old sister spend their time on the road digesting the contents of 2 archives stored in the car's trunk. A translation and also a literalization of Eliot's famous incorporation of his sources into the body of the wasteland. These archives provide the material that the boy and girl will eventually reshape when they set out to forge their own mode of being in the world. That moment comes when the family witnesses a deportation of undocumented minors on a small airfield in southern Arizona, and Louiselli transfers the role of narrator from the mother to the boy. After he convinces his sister to leave their parents and enter the desert in search of the lost children, the boy produces an increasingly hallucinatory account of experiences whose ontological status remains unfixed. The ground on which they walk belongs to Eliot. As they head towards each other into the heart of light, the two groups of children hear, quote, a sound high in the air of eagles, quote, whistling and piping as they fly amid gathering thunder clouds. Later, the sound returns as a murmur of maternal lamentation in, quote, the distant cries of a lone eagle calling for her eggs, end quote. In the interim, the children meet at the foot of an abandoned train car and discover 3 eggs which the mother eagle has left inside to preserve them on their journey. The eagle's maternal sacrifice repeats and inverts the plot lines of mothers searching for their missing children that runs throughout the novel, even as it relieves the children of their emotional exhaustion, desolation, and terror. The same sacrifice translates the sacred Hindu commands, data, dayad havam, damyata, give, sympathize, control, into a story world scraped together from surviving fragments of Aztec and Apache mythology. Restored by the eagle's act, the children experience the continent's momentary return to its original status as, quote, a land of resilience and forgiveness where the earth and sky knew no division, end quote. The fragility of this moment stands out in a novel where the present is so overwhelming that, quote, the future has become unimaginable. As the mother tells the boy in a conversation about contemporary challenges involved in building an archive, quote, we haven't understood how space and time exist now, how we really experience them. If part of the achievement of The Wasteland was the set of formal innovations that allowed Eliot to capture for so many the experience of living in a new space and time, Louiselli questions what will become of the Eliotic archive once its connection to posterity is broken. Her novel may be an archive of exactly this kind, one which documents its own lost connection to posterity. In this sense, we might say that Louiselli hangs the boy's concluding narrative in the void of a newly incomprehensible space and time, where the uncertain ontological status of the events it recounts translates Eliot's famous poem into a language we have not yet learned to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was really a fascinating connection. I think, Tony, we're going back to Will. Is that right?
No, we're going to go ahead to Marjorie now, Nancy, and we'll come back to Will at the end.
Fine. Okay. Marjorie's talk is called Lost and Found in Translation, which sounds like a really wonderful move from what we've just talked about, but I don't know the source of it. So Marjorie Perloff, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Okay. With myself. Yeah, I wanted to look at the foreign language allusions in The Wasteland. They're not as many as you would think. In other words, there are loads of references, complex allusions to other texts and cultures, but not that many that are left in the foreign languages themselves. And I wanted to look at why and how that works and how effective is it. And the answer varies. There are 12 in all that are given in their original language. Of these, one is in Greek. That's the part of the Satyricon, which I'm coming to in a minute, the Sibyl, 2 in Latin, 2 Italian, 3 French, 2 German, and 2 Sanskrit. Now, what effect does the use of the original language have on the tone and texture of the whole? Conversely, when does Eliot present his foreign source in translation? The other way around. The epigraph sets the stage, replacing as it does the original epigraph from Joseph Conrad, the horror of which Ezra Pound did not approve. And that, of course, would not have been in a foreign language. Nam sibilum quidem cumis, ego ipse oculis meus, vidin ampora pendere, et cum illi pueri dicerent Sibylla Titheles, respondebat illa apothanean thelo. Now, Eliot's source, chapter 48 of Petronius's late first century Menippean satire, the Satyricon, in which the vulgar and ostentatiously rich Trimalchio boasts of his adventures, reads in English, I saw with my own eyes the Sibyl of Cumae hanging in a jar. And when the boys asked her, Sibyl, what do you want? She responded, I want to die. The Cumaean Sibyl, and I know you all know this, but let's go through it for some who might not, was the famous prophetess painted by both Raphael and Michelangelo, who asked Apollo for immortal life, but according to Ovid, forgot to ask for eternal youth, and hence withered away, her body growing smaller and smaller with age, and finally kept in a jar. Her story is very appropriate for the wasteland, whose inhabitants are the living dead. Eliot, moreover, clearly admired the contrast between Petronius's Latin and the Sibyl's cited words, which are in Greek, giving it that macaronic quality. The combination foreshadows the mongrelized language of the wasteland, where one speech register quickly morphs into another, emphasizing the complex history and geography incorporated into Eliot's collage poem. Then too, in Virgil's Aeneid, the Cumaean Sibyl prophesied the destruction of Rome, a fitting note of doom here. Now, in English translation, the effect of the Latin-Greek contrast is, of course, lost, and so it makes sense for Eliot to provide the passage in the original with the Greek citation inside the Latin to enhance the effect. But this is not always the case. The very next foreign citation, the now famous Italian dedication, Il Miglio Fabbro, the better craftsman, is a little more equivocal than the reference to the Cumaean Sibyl. Arnaud Daniel, the Provençal troubadour poet, in Purgatorio 26, seen undergoing the refining fires of purgatory for sexual lust, was one of Dante's favorite poets. Dante praises Arnaud for being il miglio fabbro del parla materno, of the mother tongue, in other words, the vernacular, when poets were still writing in Latin. In comparing Pound to Arnaud, I wonder whether you realize this when you read it, Eliot is comparing himself to Dante. And hence the tribute is just a shade condescending, implying that the Pound may well be the better craftsman, but Eliot himself is the better poet. And it's funny because I've sometimes used that for friends in dedications, in Emilio Fabbro. When you really think about it, it is a little bit condescending. And we know that Eliot, while deeply grateful to Pound for his revisions, had his doubts about Pound's actual poetry. It is the foreign locution that makes the phrase properly exotic and hence acceptable. And it has always been accepted that way. Now let's turn to the poem itself. The very first foreign tag comes in. Summer surprised us coming over the Starnbergersee with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee, talking an hour. Bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. This, Eliot's first compound portrait in the Burial of the Dead, is a brilliant amalgam, I think, of overheard conversation, which would be in the present, that is post-war, an allusion to Marie Lariche's memoir, My Past, of 1913, pre-war. Lariche was a cousin of Ludwig II of Bavaria and evidently the confidant of the Crown Prince, Rudolf Meyerling. I'm Austrian myself, so Meyerling, is a great famous figure who committed the double suicide with his mistress, Marie Vetzera. The Hofgarten chit-chat between minor aristocrats who have come in out of the rain, the life-giving rain of the wasteland, to drink coffee, foregrounds the words of an anonymous woman who says, I'm not at all Russian, come from Lithuania, authentic German. The lady in question protests that she is not Russian, a country whose population was considered wild and uncouth by Western Europeans of the post-war. This was the period where, after all, the Russians had come and raped a lot of women at the end of the war, the end of World War I, and people really resisted them. So I'm not at all a Russian, explaining she's from Lithuania, giving herself away because provincial Lithuania had a huge Jewish population at the time. She's, in case, some parvenu pretending to be echt German. Of course, if she were really German, she wouldn't say that. The German line thus encapsulates the anomie and deracinated quality of international cafe society perfectly. The mood could not be evoked as effectively in English. I don't see any way Eliot could have achieved that particular effect in English. The citation from Wagner is equally arresting. The biblical passage that precedes it, culminating in the ominous fear in a handful of dust, suddenly gives way to a note of hope. Frisch weht der Wind, der Heimat zu, mein irisch Kind. Wo weilest du? In English, fresh blows the wind toward home, my Irish child, where are you lingering? And it is the song of the young sailor that opens Wagner's Tristan, an opera Eliot evidently first came to know through his beloved Jean Verdenal in 1911. The opera opens with Tristan bringing the Irish princess Isolde to Cornwall to be married to Tristan's uncle, King Mark, a journey that will culminate in Tristan and Isolde's drinking of the love potion and taking their oath of undying love. Now, the Tristan lines nicely introduce the Hyacinth Girl passage, the one moment in the wasteland when love seems possible, looking into the heart of light, the silence. But after those words, there's a sharp break followed by the single German line, Öd und leer das Meer, desolate and empty, the sea, spoken by the watchman in Act 3 of Tristan, warning the dying young lover who is back at his ancestral castle in Brittany that the ship-bringing Isolde, for whom he's anxiously waiting, is nowhere in sight. So in the wasteland, the Hyacinth moment, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract, ends in desolation and emptiness. Is the retention of the German original here more than an exoticism? Yes, I think so, because in English, desolate and empty the sea or fresh blows the wind would not be sufficiently evocative, even though Eliot's own notes tell us they come from Tristan and Isolde. Most readers of The Wasteland would have a rough idea of the Tristan story, but prevented thus minimally, the motif both arouses curiosity and looks ahead to Verlaine's related treatment of Parsifal in the Fire Sermon, where the hellish scene of the second verse paragraph, culminating in the bawdy ballad, "Oh, the moon shone bright on Mrs. Porter and on her daughter, they washed their feet in soda water," gives way for the momentary vision of spiritual beauty in Verlaine's poem, "Et aux ces voix d'enfants chantant dans la coupole," or the voices of children singing in the church dome. Sound, of course, also plays a role in all these instances. Öd und leer das Meer, with its internal rhyme and long open vowels that slow up the line, perfectly convey the loss of love, contrasting with the jaunty dance rhythms, Frisch weht der Wind, 8 lines above it. Now, so far, foreign lines have played their role admirably. But what about the poem's ending? I mean, I'm not going to cover them all. Don't have time here. We're following the famous responses to the give, sympathize, control commands with their exotic Sanskrit tags, da, dayatam, damyata. We're given a veritable language potpourri that brings together one line each of Italian, Latin, French, Elizabethan English, and finally more Sanskrit in one explosive burst. The passage opens brilliantly with surprisingly straightforward English, fishing with the arid plain behind me, shall I at least set my lands in order, suggesting that the poem's quester, or the Grail Knight or Fisher King, however we want to interpret that, has experienced his dark night of the soul and come out on the other side. But then London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down, and after a pause comes the reference to Arnaud Daniel diving into the refining fire, the plaintive cry of Philomela in the Latin of the Per Vigilium Veneris, longing for the time when she can be a swallow like her sister Procne and regain her stolen voice, Nerval's exiled Prince d'Aquitaine à la Tour abolie, and finally the Hieronymo of Kidd's Spanish tragedy, planning his revenge. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. We read in line 430. And then after a reprise of the 3 Sanskrit phrases and an ominous blank phrase comes the conclusion, the famous conclusion, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. And Eliot's own note reads, Shanti, repeated as here, a formal ending to Upanishad, the peace which passes understanding, is our equivalent of this word. Now, evidently, Eliot can supply a resolution to his long, complex, and mostly very dark poem only in a foreign language. And that's been commented on often. I mean, it's as if he can't say it in English. It has to be in an exotic foreign language, as foreign as possible, because none of his readers is likely to know, and hence it sounds, no Sanskrit, and hence it sounds appropriately stately and ceremonious. The first readers of The Wasteland were duly impressed by the Indian Buddhist chant, so ancient and impressive. But the use of the Sanskrit prayer raises a vexing question, one that so far I know has never been asked. Greek, Latin, French, German, Italian. These are the languages smart Oxford students and Harvard students learned at Eliot's time, but Sanskrit, and if Sanskrit, why not Hebrew? Now let's go back near the beginning of the poem, In the Burial of the Dead, to lines 19 to 26. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there's shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock. Now this passage is a collage of Old Testament voices identified in Eliot's own note, Ezekiel, Ecclesiastes, are readily identifiable, as is the Isaiah allusion in lines 25, 26. Son of man, stand upon thy feet and I will speak unto thee, Ezekiel. We read in the King James Bible, which is Eliot's source. And again, your altar shall be desolate and your images shall be broken, Ezekiel. The Ecclesiastic allusion points us to an especially striking passage in the King James. Fear shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. And the shadow under the red rock comes from Isaiah, and a man all be as a hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Now, then, none of this would be very unusual. The words of the prophets were quoted in countless poems, fictions, and songs in English poetry. And in any case, Eliot transforms his sources sufficiently so that he makes them his own. The sinister roots that clutch and branches that grow out of this stony rubbish, which come from the vegetation myths at the heart of the wasteland, and the heap of broken images, are cleverly tied to the Ecclesiastes parody, where unlike the almond tree, the dead tree gives no shelter, and so forth. My own question, and I'm going to end with this, about this passage, however, is not semantic, but cultural. Given that the poem's conclusion is in Sanskrit, hardly a language known to readers of modern poetry, why doesn't Eliot use the original Hebrew in lines 19 to 30? I once put this question to a biblical scholar at Oxford who spluttered, well, it's from the King James Bible, as if the Old Testament were written in English and no foreign language could be necessary. But what this Oxford Don was really saying, and Eliot would have had the same conviction, is that Hebrew, although as integral to the lines in question as Sanskrit is to the Upanishads or as Latin is to Virgil, is too remote, too unknown to serve citational purposes. And of course, the fact is that Eliot would not have known a word of Hebrew. In the Harvard and Oxford of his day, and I looked into this, Hebrew was in fact taught. It belonged to biblical studies or Near Eastern languages and later to Judaic studies departments. Courses in these departments were taken by scholars. Susan Howe told me she remembers her uncle, who was a scholar, being very busy learning Hebrew. But gentlemen poets like T.S. Eliot, who of course studied Latin and Greek as a matter of course, as well as French and German, and possibly Italian, mainly for the sake of Dante and Petrarch, had nothing to do with Hebrew. And who needed such an exotic and remote language when the King James Bible was surely much more poetic? Until at least the millennium, undergraduates and others who studied the wasteland didn't seem to notice the anomaly that the Hebrew prophets or the Ecclesiastes poets spoke in English. It was taken as a given that even as the Satyricon was to be reproduced in its own curious macaronic Latin and Wagner in German, the language of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, was English. But in the new century, students have noticed this slippage and Eliot's patterns of allusion and wondered what the wholesale erasure of the original Hebrew means. Is it, I've heard it asked, relatable to Eliot's anti-Semitism? Not consciously, I suppose, but the omission sheds interesting light on the preferences and prejudices of Eliot's class and the treatment of the classics in the Harvard and then Oxford of his day. Eliot's translation choices, in any case, deserve much further study. What determines those choices can help us to see the wasteland in a new light. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And I have questions about it, of course.
Sure you do. Will, yeah. May we ask questions, Nancy?
Sure.
May I ask Will a question?
Please do.
Tony's running this, but it's fine.
Please do.
It's fine with
Please
me.
do. Please get us started while we're bringing the questions in from the audience.
Oh, okay. All right. And I thought there was fascinating talk, and it makes me think of working on problems. But what I do think is it's not quite as controlling as you say in this sense. Sure, you can look up all the references, but unless you have some sense of things, you can't do much with the references. I found that with students. You can look up the Starnberger See, and it'll tell you all those things. You can look up the Hofgarten, but unless you know what it means that it's in Munich, or what Munich was, or how it functioned. I found that with the one thing I found in looking up references that most commentators are quite wrong about that passage, even if they had all the sources in the world. Marie's passage, bin gar keine Russin, Stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. They say all kinds of things about that in Lithuania because they don't understand the tone, because you have to know about the period to understand that. And I think that's true all the way through. So even if, when students look things up, as they do say for Pound's cantos, where it's even much harder than here, they come up with all kinds of things, but it doesn't make any sense. So I don't think even with the internet, and when you can look everything up, that the internet is in some way controlling you. You have to do the work, I think.
I absolutely agree on to a certain extent. Perhaps I agree with your statements less than you do, but there's no question that gets into the issues of difficulty and accessibility that I was talking about with Gail McDonald. It's still difficult. Like, you still have to do work. And sort of deep cognitive work. The internet doesn't solve anything. In fact, that would be a problem if it did. It doesn't sort of answer the question of what the wasteland is saying by any stretch of the imagination. And it still requires, as you point out, part of the much longer version of this paper before cutting it down to 15 minutes. Brought in quite a bit of the work that you would have to do in terms of what does it mean for a Lithuanian to be asserting her Deutschlichkeit a year before the beer hall putsch, right? Like that kind of thing is not something that is just answered by having an internet
not a year
there.
before. That's just it. It's not a year before the beer hall putsch, because if you take that reference seriously, that book was written in 1913, about Marie. And so you get the pre-war. The great thing in the wasteland is the way it'll telescope pre-war, post-war, all kinds of periods. So it's the telescoping that's interesting. I just want to say one more thing. You're right, about meaning, but you're assuming that the only thing is to find out what things mean. It's also very interesting to find out how they mean and how Eliot puts it together. What they mean, so what, in a way. So what?
Well, absolutely. And the how they mean is the difficulty part. That's the part that should not and cannot be totally alleviated. The problem is if someone literally, if a student, as most of my students do, if a student doesn't know where Lithuania is, or doesn't have any sense of what is the Hofgarten, what are they even talking about, then that creates essentially an impassable barrier between reading the words on the page and drawing that kind of connection that you're talking about. So what a web reading does, my argument, what a web reading does is it makes it accessible, but not less difficult. In fact, it makes it more difficult to some extent.
Yeah, good.
Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in. So Nancy, if it's all right, I'm gonna
Go ahead.
I'm gonna spotlight John Whittier Ferguson and let him post one.
Thanks, folks, and thanks for handling all this, Tony, and the panel too. Just a quick question for Marjorie, and maybe one for Will too. I just wondered, Marjorie, what you, just speaking of just in the most literal, mundane sense of what you do with just the fact that Eliot studied Sanskrit at Harvard, and so there's a way in which his using of Sanskrit in the poem seems to me to register, and that would be at least worth registering, I think, as you're laying out an argument about what Shanti's doing in the poem, as opposed to what Hebrew's doing in the poem. It just seems relevant to his own inquiry after Eastern religions and his fascination with a novel language that, to him at least, that was a new thing at the turn of the century.
Yeah, but that's a kind of exoticism. I mean, how much did he really know about India? Or I wonder what most Indian scholars would say about that. Sure, you can make the connection to the Upanishads, and he did study some Sanskrit.
Right.
That's just it. It's what you decide to study.
Right. Sure.
So, I mean, it's just an interesting little factoid. It's not in a way that important, but I thought it was very interesting the way, if you ask most people, they say, well, of course, it's the King James Bible, as if it had become a norm I mean, the Hebrew Bible, Robert Alter in his recent study,
Right.
read Hebrew, but Robert Alter did make me wish I
Yeah.
because the Hebrew is very beautiful too.
Yeah.
It could be, and it could have
Sure.
created a certain kind of mood or certain kind of contrast, but Eliot never does that. And it's
Right.
also because it was sort of considered, no, I don't want to get involved in that kind of thing.
Yeah. In fact, it might even strengthen your argument just to mention the Sanskrit fact, because that he didn't take Hebrew and did take Sanskrit seems to be something worth registering in some ways. And I guess, Will, this might relate to your the last comment you made, the last phrase about teaching the poem, which is obviously where a lot of your theory comes to purchase in the world itself. It's often struck me that it's much our students are much more familiar with the textual theoretical apparatus of modernism than the modernist readers were, precisely because of the net and because of the dispersal of them. So I wondered ways in which you try to make the poem strange or modern again, because it seems to me that in some ways your readers come to the poem already equipped to know about the post-structural apparatus that spin out into what all reading actually turns out to be, which is what you diagram on the screen. Are there ways in which you found your attempts that you found useful to make the poem as odd as it actually is, as opposed to the way in which it's also more familiar now than it ever was in 1922? I don't know.
Well, I have a lot of projects that I've attempted on that method. So you're asking about actually teaching the poem in the classroom. So there's a variety of different versions of the poem that are available in digital form. There's like a iPad version that Andrew Klobuchar did some interesting theoretical analysis of. There's any number of sort of annotated versions. There are many, many, many annotated versions, probably more of this poem than any other modernist poem, certainly. There's a genius.com version that got shut down and they had to transfer it over to Bartleby for some reason, and now it doesn't work that well. I've attempted this kind of thing with students a few different times. I have this big project that I'm trying to put together that I call the Versions Project, which is problematic because of the website, the Modernist Versions Project, that looks at different ways of doing it such that you could encode, for instance, every single word can automatically link to the first result on a Google search through, it's a very small amount of code, through like an I'm feeling lucky button function, such that when you click on the word, it automatically brings up whatever the internet says is the primary piece of information to explain that that word or that phrase or that symbol. And of course, the nice thing with that is that it mutates over time based on user practices, particularly through something like Google that uses PageRank, which is sort of a social ranking system for search terms, without going too in depth about how it works. So that's something that I've been playing with. I wouldn't say that I have a critical mass of data to really come to any conclusions about it, but I certainly think that the web, and particularly through search algorithms and through various JavaScript coding, the web provides ample space to, I almost want to say defamiliarize the way that the language works, but at the same time, it might be, and this is something that I'm playing around with, it might be that the web spaces and those kind of mechanisms for contemporary, let's say Gen Z readers, Americans, Gen Z readers, the web style reading where it does those kind of funky movements might actually be more familiar.
Yeah, exactly. That's, I guess, in
Codex,
something, right.
Which then raises a problem because part of what we do, part of what the poem arguably does is it tries to defamiliarize, it tries to alienate, it tries to,
Precisely.
right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's
Go
good.
ahead, Susan.
I'll jump in here for a second. So this is a poem that I teach in classes where I rarely teach any other poetry because that poem becomes so important for the fiction that I go on to teach. And so as I was thinking about the question and answer, I was remembering how startled I am to hear my students, not the ones I would expect, talk about how beautiful the poem is. And I'm wondering if its beauty is that door to the unfamiliar that you're looking for. It might be a different door than contemporary readers when it came out would have used, because at that time they may have found the poem ugly. But I'm always moved when my students talk spontaneously about beauty, and this is one of the poems in which they do bring that up.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to go ahead and wrap up now, Nancy, if that's all right with you.
Yes, I thought this was really fascinating, and I just wanted to tell people that what we're looking at next time puts together two very different kinds of sources for Eliot, long-term interest in his religion, but also discussions of the T.S. Eliot letters to Emily Hale. This is part of the amazing new material that nobody's seen until last January, but most of us can't see anyway because COVID kept us out of the Princeton Library. So we'll take a break and then come back.
Yeah.